Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah show. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Am Yetz Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Beis, completing Siman Shin Lamed Zayin, and hopefully beginning Siman Shin Lamed Ches. We pick up today on the bottom of Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Aleph, the very bottom line in middle of the words of the Ramah. I'm going to begin again from the word V'chein al Yidei Beged, which is at the middle of the bottom line here on Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Aleph Siman Shin Lamed Zayin in middle of Sif Beis. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesunu Batzar Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yotziim Yitzar Lervacha Me'afel La'ira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagalo of Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Esther Fradel Bas Chana Meshemer ben Esther Fradel Yitzchak ben Sian ben Dusha Rivka Bas Shiraleach Havadasa Bas Serel Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana Gila Shifra Bas Ilana Udal. They should all have a refuah shalema b'sashar Chayle Yisrael. Okay, so we've been speaking over here about sweeping floors. And the Ramah says here at the bottom of Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Aleph, V'chein al yidei beged oy matlis oy knaf avos hakalim. And this is why I started from here again. Even though I did this yesterday, I realized that there's a little bit of a continuation of this sentence on the beginning of Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Beis. So again, V'chein, similarly, you're allowed to sweep al yidei beged oy matlis oy knaf avos hakalim, using some kind of a lightweight fabric, a rag, or some very light, fluffy goose feathers, because they are light. And continuing to Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Beis, ve'enoi mashve gumais, and therefore they are not going to have the effect of being mashve gumais. Basically, these are lightweight things that will only have the effect of maybe brushing away some loose dirt, the loose dust on the top of the floor, but it's not going to be able to have the effect of smoothing out the floor, filling in any gaps, etc., that would pose an issue of mashve gumais. I think we did Mishnah Berurah's Cut Yud Aleph, but in case, let's do it over again. On Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Aleph says the Mishnah Berurah is Cut Yud Aleph, Hakalim. Ritzayin Aloymar, what the Ramah wants to say over here is, Tekevin Shehim Kalim, since these are lightweight things, Einoi Noitel Behem Raka Avak Shalamala. All they will do is sweep away the lightweight dust that's on top of the floor. They're not going to be able to have the effect of leveling out the floor and filling in divots. Kain Kasav Darkei Moshe, so says the Ramah in the Darkei Moshe on the Torah. Umuchach mizeh, we can see from here, Shem roitza lechabed behem heitev as kol ha'afruriyos and mitzvahs ba'aretz sha'asur. Since the logic over here is that these lightweight materials cannot have the effect of being mashve gumais, but if you want to get very aggressive with your feather duster, if you want to get very aggressive with your rag, and you're going to press down, and you're going to go very intensely and very aggressively sweeping on the floor so that you'll be mashve gumais, that is certainly going to be usher. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, Cut Yud Beis, Kuf Pei Gimel Amid Beis, ve'enoi v'alkein mutar afilu enoi merutzef. The Ramah, the Mishnah Berurah is saying here that what the Ramah is telling you is using these lightweight items is mutar even on a bare floor, because it's not going to be mashve gumais. Va'afilu yesh babayis klipe agoizim v'kayotze behem. Now, let's say you have nutshells on the floor, or you have other waste material which really is muktzah machmas gufay. So vafilu yesh babayis klipe agoizim v'kayotze midvarim ha'asurim betiltel, things that are muktzah, and now you're going to go sweep them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu hachi mutar lechabed, it still would be mutar to sweep. And over here he brings down one of the counter arguments that we had against the muktzah issue of sweeping floors that we spoke about previously, and this he brings down from the Rashba in the Bir Halacha. He says, "Afilu achi mutar lechabed havalel didei kigraf shel rei." No, was that the Rashba or was that the Kasav Rashba? Yeah, the Rashba had said that these kind of items would really be a graf shel rei. Over here in the brackets it says achroinim, interestingly enough. Kasav b'sefer kalkel Shabbos, it says in the sefer kalkel Shabbos, Dehu adin b'mashikern barsht harakim, some kind of a broom that was called a barsht, and the bristles were soft. Dinoi gamkein kiknaf avos, it would have the same halacha as the feather duster, because also it can't have the effect of being mashve gumais. V'ayin bebir halacha dibra maschal akalim, de'en kedai lahakal bazeh ella be merutzif. Okay, now we go weiter. Top line, Kuf Pei Gimel Amud Beis, continues the Ramah. We have been speaking until now about sweeping floors. Now the Ramah makes mention of a halacha that we really covered in Siman Shin Beis, and that is the question of dusting off garments. Says the Ramah, Va'asr lechabeid habegodim al yedei machbadois ha'asuyim mikismim. You're not allowed to brush the dust off of a beged using some kind of a brush that is made mikismim, which is, what's the right English word for this? Kismim are really like splinters, but it's like bristles, kind of like stiff wooden bristles. And why is this also, says the Ramah, Shalo yishtabru kismehem, because by doing this, you're going to break the bristles. And breaking those bristles, let's say that 10 times fast, breaking those bristles would be an issue of breaking a keli. You're not allowed to break a keli on Shabbos. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Yud Gimel, Lachabed habegadim, you're not allowed to brush off garments. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out right away, if you're going to speak about brushing the dust off a garment, you can't mention this halacha without mentioning Siman Shin Beis. In Siman Shin Beis, we spoke about the issue of dusting off begadim and the isser of malabein, of laundering. And we learned over there in Shin Beis that, at least according to some shittas, to dust off a beged can be an issue of malabein. So the Mishnah Berurah says over here, Mishnah Berurah points out, what the Ramah is telling you over here is, milavad, any issue of malabein. Certainly, if you're going to dust off a beged, right away you have to know, is there an issue of malabein in dusting off a beged? Now, we learned in Shin Beis in the Ramah, and the Mishnah Berurah alludes to it right here, kigoin bebeged yashon, if you have an old beged, so it's not so crisp, shein makbid alav, it's an old beged, you're not so makbid on it, v'chadoima, or some such begadim, v'chamavur le'el b'simin Shin Beis sif aleph b'haga. We learned over there that if you have a black, new beged, so the particles of dust really show up strongly, and you're makbid, you're going out in a nice, fancy, black, new garment, you don't want to see dust on it. So you're makbid on it. You want the dust off. When you go to shake the dust off or brush the dust off, you really have a kavanah for malabein. So that would be that would pose malabein issues. Ayin Siman Shin Beis. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here is, when the Ramah says you're not allowed to brush the dust off a beged using a machbed shel kismim because of the issue of breaking the keli, first of all, it has to be a type of beged that you're allowed to brush the dust off of. Then if you have a type of beged that you're allowed to brush the dust off of, you should know there's an additional issue, and that is you can't use these machbedos of kismim, because you might come to break the bristles, which would constitute breaking a beged. So again, breaking, which would constitute breaking a keli. Okay, so again, let's just read from the beginning of Eis Cut Yud Gimel Lechabed Begadim. Hainu afilu ba'ofen shemitzad hakibud ba'atzvam ein behem iser. What the Ramah means is even in a case where there is no intrinsic problem of malabein in brushing off the beged, kigoyin bebeged yashan she'in makbid alav, you have an old beged that you're not makbid on, v'chadoima v'chamavur le'el b'simin Shin Beis sef aleph ba'aga, then there's still an issue of breaking a keli. Well, hu adin she'asa behem lechabed es hashulchan. So, since the issue that we're discussing over here is the issue of breaking the bristles, the same halacha would be true that you wouldn't be allowed to use one of these brushes in order to brush the crumbs off of a table. Because even though there's no malabein issue, I'm not talking about a tablecloth, I'm talking about a table, there's no malabein on a wooden table, but breaking the bristles, that would be an issue. Even though mitzad atzmai, the etzem act of brushing off a table is mutter kamavur b'shas, like the Gemara says, Kuf Mem Gimel Amid Aleph. Ois cut yadalid. The problem over here is shalayishtabru kismehem. You can't use such a brush because you might come to break the bristles. Well, if he's there, according to this, who adin she'asa lechabir abayis avilu b'merutzav laman deshari b'machpedois asuyais v'anfe ilon yeveshim she'enon nichpafim. The point of the Mishnah Berurah is, even in cases where you're allowed to sweep floors. So we discussed yesterday that nowadays, where really nobody has earthen floors in their houses, all of our houses are merutzif. The floors are covered with something, so therefore sweeping is mutter, but you're not allowed to sweep, says the Mishnah Berurah, using some kind of a broom that has wooden bristles, I don't know what else to call them, that will break. So I remember years ago going to camp, and or in yeshiva, all of the brooms were those brooms that had straw at the bottom, or they were corn front, whatever it is, but they broke very easily. You wouldn't be allowed to use that on Shabbos because it would be a problem of breaking a keli. De bevadai nishbarim. And with the word bevadai, what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you is it's a psik reisha. That's why it's an issue. You'll tell me, well, what's the problem? It's a davar she'eino miskaven. Yeah, it's a davar she'eino miskaven, but it's a psik reisha. De bevadai nishbarim kemeshem chabdim behem, because they're certainly going to break while you sweep. V'tam kol zeh, and the issue over here is the heavy kamay seiser keli, because you're breaking a keli. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out that really there's a mitigating factor. And we're going to take a look at Shar Hatziyah and Ois Katan Yud, where the Chavetz Chaim is going to say there really are multiple mitigating factors why this shouldn't be usher. In the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim mentions one, Vav Shemakalkal Potter. Wait a second, you're breaking a keli. We know that the rule by Melecha Shabbos is that a malacha is generally speaking only usher when it's positive, when you're accomplishing something positive. But when it's mekalkal, well, when you're ruining something, that makes it no longer a meleches machasheves. We don't consider it to be usher anymore when you're doing something that's mekalkal, when you're ruining something. Now over here, you're sweeping with the broom and you're telling me that the bristles are going to break. Well, that's ruining the broom. So it's mekalkal. What's the problem? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mikamakam also lechatchila. You're right. Mekalkal is a mitigating factor, but it still is also lechatchila, says the Mishnah Berurah. Now, let's take a look at the Shar Hatziyah, Ois Katan Yud, where indeed he tells us that that's not the only mitigating factor over here. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ois Katan Yud, Hainu afshehu gam kem psik reisha d'loi nichale. Also, what are you telling me? You're telling me that the problem is that you're breaking a keli, and you'll argue it's a davar she'eino miskaven. The counter argument is, well, it's a psik reisha. Yeah, but this is what we call a psik reisha d'loi nichale. You don't want your broom to get ruined, so you buy a nice new broom. Yes, it's true that over time the bristles are going to break off and eventually you're going to need a new broom. But you don't want the bristles to be breaking, so even though it's a psik reisha that you're going to break the keli while you sweep, it's a psik reisha d'loi nichale. So that's another mitigating factor over here why this really should be mutter. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Mikol mokom lechatchila ein kedai. Lechatchila, says the Chavetz Chaim, not kedai to go up against this. So even though it's mekalkal, even though it's a psik reisha d'loi nichale, still in all, you should not do it. Ukemai, and he gives us an interesting example over here, and I think this is a very important Shar Hatziyah for people to remember. Ukemai, begoyer kelim gedolim beyoser al gabe karka. We spoke in the beginning of the Siman, right? We said you drag a big heavy bench on the earth. So it's if it is inevitably going to make a charitz, going to make a trench in the karka, so you're doing the malacha of chayrish. Albeit it's a davar she'eino miskaven. You're not interested in making a trench, but still in all, it's a psik reisha. And we said that that's usher. Points out the Chavetz Chaim here. The gam sham im yishav charitz u'mekalkal sabayis al yidei agumos. Let's say you're doing this inside a house, and you're dragging this heavy chair or a heavy dining room table in a house that has an earthen floor. You're right, it's going to make a charitz. It's a psik reisha that it's going to make a charitz. Yeah, but it's a psik reisha d'loi nichale. You don't want a trench in your dining room. So l'chayr it's a psik reisha d'loi nichale. V'u psik reisha d'loi nichale, afilu hachi aser lechatchila. Still in all, says the Chavetz Chaim, don't think that psik reisha d'loi nichale right away is something that is mutter. He says over here, even though it's a psik ratio, it remains usher. Something to look into a little bit more when we have a chance. Okay, continues the Mechaber, Sif Gimel. 2 lines off the top, middle of the line, says the Mechaber. Ein sochin es hakarka. Literally, what those words mean is you're not allowed to anoint the floor. Well, let's take a look here at the very interesting Mishnah Berurah Katan Tezvav. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein sochin, pirush. What is the interpretation? What is this sochin? What did they used to do? Says the Chavetz Chaim, pirush, darkam haya losuch shemen al hakarka shal beis hamerchatz. They used to pour oil and smear oil on the floor of the Beis HaMerchatz, v'kayoytzabay, ulehiskalgel aleim, and then they would roll in the oil. So apparently this was something that was done in the Beis HaMerchatz. You went and you took a nice hot bath, and then after the bath you got out and you rolled on the oily floor. Okay, sounds interesting. But different times, different cultures, different ideas, and apparently this is something that they used to do. I also saw brought down that it's not only that they did this in order to roll in the oil. There was a dual purpose. One purpose was to make the floor shiny, so this was waxing the floor. The other idea was, once it was that way, people would roll in the oil. Now, why it wasn't slippery, I don't know, but maybe it wasn't, I don't know. Could be, again, the truth is, if it's an earthen floor, even if it's packed earth, if it's an earthen floor and you put oil on it, it's not going to be slippery. Okay. So, says the Mechaber, Ein sochin es hakarka. You're not allowed to put this oil on the floor. And you're also not allowed to wash the floor. And both of these are usher, says the Mechaber, afilu hu merutzif. This is not only usher by a bare earthen floor, it's even usher by a covered floor. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Let's see what's at work over here. So it says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Tezayin, v'loy madichin oisai. You're not allowed to put the oil on the floor. You're also not allowed to wash the floor. Now, how did they wash the floor? Apparently, they washed the floor with an interesting version of spongia. For those of you that are familiar with how they wash floors in Eretz Yisrael, what did they do? Shayu paikikin siloin shahamayim nichnesu derech ba lebeis hamerchatz. They would stop up the hole that allowed the water to come into the Beis HaMerchatz. I'm sorry, they would open it. Shayu paikikin siloin shamayim nichnesu derech ba lebeis hamerchatz. They would open up the stopper that allows the water to flow into the Beis HaMerchatz, and they would open up a hole on the other side, so that the water should flow through the Beis HaMerchatz, and it should have the effect of washing out the dirty, smelly, malodorous water from the Beis HaMerchatz. Okay. V'tam kolela. Now, why is this a problem? So the Mechaber told us that 2 things are usher over here. One thing that's usher over here is to go ahead and smear the oil on the floor of the Beis HaMerchatz. The other thing that we're saying over here is usher. I misspoke. I made a mistake over here. The Mishnah Berurah says that the way they wash the floor, again, let's go back to the beginning of Tezayin. Shayu paikikin. Paikin means they would stop up. I got confused here for a second. Shayu paikikin siloin shamayim nichtusu da derech ba lebeis hamerchatz. It sounds like they would have a channel that would channel the water into the actual baths. And apparently they would close that up. Now that would not stop the flow of water. The flow of water would continue into the Beis HaMerchatz, and therefore the water wouldn't go into the actual baths. I guess it would go out onto the floors. And then they would open up a drain hole somewhere else in the Beis HaMerchatz so that the water would flow through the Beis HaMerchatz on the floor, and it would wash out the Beis HaMerchatz. And says the Chavetz Chaim, why is it that you're not allowed to do these things? Why can't you put the oil on the floor? Why can't you wash the floor? And again, what's the issue? The issue is being mashve gumais. You can imagine if you're going to wash the floor down, so the floor is going to become leveled. So you're going to be filling in holes by doing this. So the problem is mashve gumois. Va'afil lamad deshari kibud b'Shabbos. And even according to the first opinion that we had in the Mechaber Sif Beis, the first opinion in Sif Beis, we said, the Mechaber said in Sif Beis, that you're not allowed to sweep the house unless the floor is covered, right? But by a merutzif, by a floor that's covered, the first opinion in the Mechaber said that you are allowed to sweep the floor. And we explained over there why is that, because the first opinion holds that it's not a psik reisha, that when you sweep you're going to be mashve gumos, so it's a davar she'ein miskaven. And according to that shita, now that happens to be the shita Rambam. According to that shita, we're also not goizer eina merutzif otu merutzif. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah like this. Lost the place over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "Va'afilu laman deshari kibud b'Shabbos." We're saying over here the Mechaber is presenting only one opinion over here in Sif Gimel. He's telling you you're not allowed to put the oil on the floor and you're not allowed to wash down the floor. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the problem? The problem is that you're going to be mashve gumos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but we had the first opinion in Sif Beis, the shita of the Rambam, who says that when you have a floor that's merutzif, you are allowed to go ahead and sweep the floor. And not only that, I'm sorry. Boy, that's the second mistake I made over here. Sorry, Rabbi say. In Sif Beis, we had the first opinion in Sif Beis said you're not allowed to sweep the house unless the floor is covered. The second opinion in Sif Beis, that's the Shita Rambam. The second Shita in Sif Beis says, V'yesh matirin afilu einoi merutzif. There are those that are matir even if the floor is not covered. Now, what is the reason for that heter? The reason for that heter, we saw on Kuf Pei Gimel Amal Aleph in Mishnah Berurah Kat Ches, we saw that the reason for that heter is because this Shita holds that it is not, I believe it's the Shita Rambam, it looks like it's the Shita of the Bahag, okay. We said that this Shita holds that it is not a psik reisha that when you sweep a floor, you're going to be mashve gumos. So again, what we're referencing back to now in Sif Beis is the second opinion in Sif Beis that holds that you're allowed to sweep even a bare earthen floor. Why? Because it's not a psik reisha that you're going to be mashve gumos. If you are mashve gumos, it's going to be a davar she'ein miskaven, and therefore it's going to be mutter. So now, says the Mishnah Berurah, in Sif Beis, we had this opinion that holds that you're allowed to sweep even a bare earthen floor. Now, in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber is telling us you're not allowed to wash the floor or pour oil on the floor. And the problem with that is that you're going to be mashve gumos. And over here, the Mechaber doesn't bring us a yesh matirin. The Mechaber doesn't say over here that, there's a yesh matirin, like he does in Sif Beis, the second opinion. Why not? Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why not. Because afilu laman deshari kibud b'Shabbos, even according to the yesh matirin in Sif Beis, that allows you to sweep a bare earthen floor on Shabbos because it's not a psik reisha that you're going to be mashve gumos. Shani hacha, over here where you're pouring oil on the floor or washing down the floor, it's different. Why? Not because it's a psik reisha. That's not what the Mishnah Berurah is going to say. He says it's different. Dekeven chu roitza leyapos es hakarka. When you go to pour the oil on the floor, or when you go do this sponger situation to wash the floor down, your kavanah is to improve the floor. That is the focus. That's the purpose of this project. The purpose of this project is to improve the floor. And losachaisa, to go shine it up with oil hadicha, or to wash it. Now that you're embarking on a project of improving the floor, we're afraid that while you're doing it, that's what you're focused on. You might see gumos, you might see divots in the floor, v'yishkach, and you're going to forget Shabbos, v'yavai la'ashvoisam b'miskavein. And now, forget davar she'ein miskaven. Now, once you're involved in improving the floor of the Beis HaMerchatz, you might come to actually go ahead and be mashve gumos bekavana. And to be mashve gumos bekavana in a house is boina. That would be boina daraisa. So that's why over here even this sheet would answer it. So again, just to wrap up, since I got confused, I have to be afraid that I confused you. So let's just wrap this up. We have, the Mechaber said, you're not allowed to pour oil on the floor of the Beis HaMerchatz. You're not allowed to wash down the floor of the Beis HaMerchatz. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the issue? The issue is that you're going to come to be mashve gumos. That's the isser. Frek the Mishnah Berurah, right? The Mishnah Berurah points out, you might wonder, in Sif Beis, when we spoke about sweeping floors, the problem of sweeping floors is also the problem of being mashve gumos. And in Sif Beis, we brought down a yesh matirin that says that you're allowed to sweep even a bare earthen floor, and we're not concerned with the issue of mashve gumos. Why? Because they hold it's not a psik ratio. Over here in Sif Gimel, we don't have a yesh matirin. Why not? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. I'll tell you why not. Because there's a difference in the project. In Sif Beis, you're not focusing on improving the floor. In Sif Beis, you're going to sweep the dust off the floor. You're just sweeping the floor. You're not improving the floor. By the Beis HaMerchatz, you're not just sweeping the dust off the surface of the floor. You want to refresh the floor. When you're focusing on refreshing the floor by washing it down or pouring oil on it, you might come to inspect the floor, see gumos, and then you might be mashve gumos bekavana, which would be Baina 101. Okay, let's go weiter. The Mechaber ended Sif Gimel by saying that to pour oil on the floor or to wash the floor is aser afilu hu merutzef, even if the floor is covered. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? There's no problem of mashve gumos by merutzef, the gazrinan atu she'enoi merutzef, because the Rambam says that we're geyser merutzef atu enoi merutzef. If we allow you to do this on a covered floor, you might come to do it on an uncovered floor. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'ha dehiter b'sif beis le'inyid kibud v'loy gazar kain. Oh, now is where we're referencing the Deya Rishona, the first opinion in Sif Beis. The first opinion in Sif Beis said you're not allowed to sweep a bare earthen floor, because the first opinion in Sif Beis held that it is a psik ratio, that you're going to come to be mashve gumos. So no, you can't sweep a bare earthen floor. But the Deya Rishona said a covered floor you could sweep. Why could you sweep a covered floor? Because there's no problem of mashve gumos. Okay, and apparently over there we're not geyser merutzif atu einoi merutzif. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'ha dehiter b'sif beis le'inyin kibud v'loy gazar kain. In Sif Beis, the Deya Rishona doesn't make a gzeira merutzif atu einoi merutzif. He says you can't sweep a bare earthen floor, mashve gumos, but you could sweep a covered floor. Why? Why don't we make a gzeira merutzif atu einoi merutzif? And we do make such a gzeira over here by washing the floor. Says the Mishnah Berurah, mishum dekibud u'yoseh davar nachutz be'adacha. The Chazal felt that we have to give people the ability to sweep floors. That is a davar nachutz. That's something that's very important. People don't want to live in filth. People have to be able to sweep up a mess off the floor. So they weren't ready to go make a gzeira and be geyser merutzif atu einoi merutzif to prohibit sweeping. And that's much more important. Mehadacha. It's not necessary to mop the floor all the time, right? Housewives and house husbands are often sweeping the floor, but they're not often mopping the floor. So obviously, sweeping the floor is more of a davar nachutz than mopping the floor. V'dan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah, the hadachas ritzpas hakroshim shenai hagin kayoim, to wash the floors that are covered with wooden boards like they have nowadays in Radin, in the times of the Chavetz Chaim, yesh paseh oid iser lasis b'Shabbos v'levad hadacha. There's also another problem. The hatzarich lazeh shrias aluntis b'mayim ki yadua v'yesh paseh mishum kibus. Generally, when they mop the floor, they used some kind of fabric. So you're soaking a fabric. Okay, shriyasa hi kibusai. Now you're coming up against malabain again. So points out the Mishnah Berurah, there's another problem with mopping and washing a floor, besides the problem of being mashve gumos, and that is that you might come up against malabain. Halacha l'maisa, we taka do not wash or mop floors on Shabbos. Okay. Moving along to the final sif of Siman Shin Lamed Zayin, Sif Dal. It says to Mechaber. Interesting halacha. Imagine you have a big heavy barrel of wine, and it's sitting on an earthen floor. Now, if you take a big barrel of wine and you put it on a nice level ceramic tile floor or a wooden floor or a concrete floor, it's going to sit nice and still. But if you take a big heavy barrel of wine and you put it on dirt, the dirt's not so stable. The barrel could be tilted. So what you want to do is you want to take the barrel, you want to put it on the dirt, and then you want to rock it, and you want to push it into place so that it should be nice and straight and stable. Says the Mechaber, Asur l'tzadei chavis halaretz. You're not allowed to do that. Tekevin shi kveda, because it's a heavy barrel, yavai lahashvais gumais vadai. They have a psik reisha. Imagine, visualize this in your head. You have an earthen floor. You take a big heavy cask of wine. You put it on the floor, you rock it to make it nice and straight and stable. When you pick up that barrel and take it out, what are you going to see? You're going to see the imprint of a barrel, and the ground underneath where that was is going to be nice and level and smooth. So, guess what you're doing? You're being mashve gumais. Now, it's a davar she'en miskaven. You have no interest in being mashve gumais, but it's a psik reisha, says the Mechaber. So you're not allowed to do this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yudches L'Tzadeid, Hainu Shu Mitzadeda. Mitzadeda means you're rocking it side to side. That's the shirish is tzad. Tzad, not tzad as in trapping. A tzad, a side. Mitzaded, you're moving it side to side. Achetamid bekarka yofe al yedei atzidud, until it's firmly placed in the ground by virtue of the fact that you rocked it. Chavis ala aretz, you're not allowed to do this with a barrel on the ground. Hainu chavis malaya. We're talking about a nice full barrel. V'chein, similarly, lo yachriya hachavis. If you want to pour wine out of the barrel, you should not tilt it on the ground, v'yishbach b'mena, so that you could pour from it. Ela, rather, magbia min haaretz, you should lift it up off the ground, v'shoifech, and then pour. Shem loikein, because if you tilt a heavy barrel while it's on the ground, yachbir min haaretz b'vadai, you're definitely going to dig. What do you mean you're going to dig? When you tilt the barrel, the leading edge of the barrel is going to dig deeper into the ground. And you're not allowed to do that. Vavsha mekalkalhu, even though this is a mekalkal, because now you're making the ground really not level. V'gam malacha she'etzvich legufehi, and you're not interested in this. V'gam chayfer klachayadhu, and it's also chayfer klachayad. This is not the way you dig with a full wine barrel. So even though you have all of these mitigating factors, afal pikein aser midivrei seifrim, it's still aser midrabanan. Ois chaf. The Kevan, since you're definitely going to be mashve gumais v'ev psik reisha, you're not allowed to do this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ratzalemar, Dal yedei atzidud gufa nasa hakarka kadei sheyeh chalaka b'loy gumais. Like we said, when you rock the barrel, you're going to smooth out the earth that's under the barrel, and you're going to fill in any divots. Alva b'taisvus Shabbos shamashma d'loy of psik reisha. Taisvus Shabbos actually suggests that the problem might not be that it's a psik reisha. Ela the aser mitam shema yishkach v'yavei lahashvais gumais b'miskaven kedei she'inoich lo yatzidud. Taisvus Shabbos suggests that the problem is not so much that it's a psik reisha that you're going to be mashve the gumais under the barrel, as much as when you come to firmly place a barrel in the ground, you might first level out the area that you want to put the barrel on, and you might come to be mashve gumais. V'hine, imot l'tzaded al gabi karka merutzefes. Are you allowed to do this on a covered floor, or are we going to be geyser ein merutzef hata merutzef? Taisvus Shabbos kasav the mutter afilu das al shulchan aruch the sphere laid have a psik reisha. It would still be mutter to do it on a covered floor. Like gazru bazem merutzefes, we don't make such a gzera. Ayin sham. V'apri begada b'reisha siman mitzadid lahachmer. Pri Megada wants to be machmer. Vayin sham b'mishpat zayzav ois gimel machikasav ois bazevadan. You should know the kol siman azel lav dafka in Shabbos. He gives us a very important reminder. This whole Siman Shin Lamed Zayin is not only negeya to Shabbos, duha didlin in Yom Tov, it's also negeya to Yom Tov mi beitza chaf beid amid beis v'yesh nichshalin bazeh. Okay, we're going to pause over here. I know it's a little bit off the bottom of the page, but we're going to pause over here, and we will continue with Siman Shin Lamed Ches next time. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be Megan on God's Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua Sefuras Parnasa and Shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.